Welcome to the future of understanding. This is NeuroMind Insights, where we unlock the power of your mind.
Billions consume ethanol, and hundreds of millions use THC. They are constantly compared as if they perform the exact same function, yet their base chemical properties dictate entirely different biological pathways. This contrast begins at the molecular level. Ethanol is a small molecule, comprising just 2 carbon atoms, 6 hydrogens, and an oxygen. Tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, is a massive, complex structure built from 21 carbon atoms. Ethanol's small, hydrophilic structure allows it to move with minimal resistance. It diffuses quickly through the watery environments of your body and easily permeates cellular membranes. THC is highly lipophilic, or fat-soluble. Because of its structural size and affinity for lipids, it tends to accumulate within fatty tissues, embedding itself deeply and lingering far longer within the lipid-rich environment of the brain. These geometric traits lead directly to their respective clinical outcomes. Ethanol operates by driving widespread suppression of the central nervous system, eventually causing physical degradation of the organs that metabolize it. THC operates through targeted neuromodulation. It alters how synaptic signals are processed, inducing changes in neural function rather than causing structural tissue damage. Recognizing this base chemistry provides the framework for predicting exactly why a person experiences an alcohol blackout versus the cognitive fog of cannabis. This diagram illustrates the gastrointestinal tract, mapping the highly predictable route ethanol takes once consumed. Between 10 and 20% of alcohol absorbs directly through the stomach lining, while the vast majority is taken up rapidly by the small intestine. If the stomach is empty, blood alcohol concentrations typically hit their peak in a narrow window of 30 to 60 minutes. The primary physiological variable that alters this curve is the presence of macronutrients. Fats and proteins slow down gastric emptying, delaying peak absorption by up to 3 hours. THC absorption is completely different. Its pharmacokinetic profile is entirely dictated by the method of administration. This model traces the inhalation pathway. When smoked or vaporized, THC passes across the pulmonary capillaries and enters systemic circulation in a matter of minutes. Ingestion bypasses the lungs. Orally consumed THC must travel through the digestive tract and enter the hepatic portal system, forcing a detour directly to the liver before it can reach general circulation. This routing initiates hepatic first-pass metabolism. Inside the liver, specific enzymes act on the ingested delta-9 THC molecule, structurally altering it. The liver converts delta-9 THC into a distinct compound known as 11-hydroxy-THC. This specific metabolite is highly potent. Its creation explains exactly why edible cannabis products have a delayed clinical onset, yet produce a significantly higher intensity and duration of psychological effects. Alcohol provides a singular, reliable curve of absorption, but THC's clinical intensity relies entirely on whether or not it undergoes this first-pass hepatic metabolism. Once in the bloodstream, ethanol acts as a broad-spectrum depressant on the central nervous system. We can see this dual mechanism playing out at the synaptic level. Ethanol simultaneously enhances the effects of GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, while suppressing the excitatory neurotransmitter, glutamate. The biological result acts like a global dimmer switch, lowering electrical activity across the board. In the prefrontal cortex, this suppression reduces the firing rates associated with judgment and impulse control, resulting in behavioral disinhibition. As the dose increases, suppression reaches the hippocampus. The brain physically loses the ability to form and consolidate new memories, leading to an anterograde amnesia, clinically recognized as a blackout. When suppression hits the cerebellum, the system loses the ability to manage physical coordination and balance, causing ataxia. At high concentrations, ethanol suppresses the brainstem. This region controls critical autonomic functions, and extreme suppression here triggers fatal respiratory and cardiac failure. THC interacts with the brain through an entirely separate network, the endocannabinoid system. Instead of shutting down neural firing, THC binds to widespread CB1 receptors. It acts as a neuromodulator, scrambling and altering how presynaptic neurotransmitters are released and received. In the hypothalamus, this modulation distorts the normal pathways that regulate satiety signaling. The brain falsely registers a state of extreme hunger, causing the hyperphagia, commonly known as the munchies. This targeted receptor binding also distorts how working memory and attention are organized. Information processing becomes fragmented, creating a cognitive fog, which is clinically distinct from the total memory blockade induced by alcohol. Critically, there is an anatomical absence of CB1 receptors in the medullary respiratory centers of the brainstem. Because THC cannot bind to the neurons controlling respiration, it cannot force the lungs to stop breathing. Alcohol turns down the global volume of the central nervous system. THC simply changes the channel, making fatal autonomic depression a risk strictly unique to ethanol. Beyond the central nervous system, these compounds trigger distinct localized autonomic responses in the periphery. This sagittal cross-section illustrates how THC directly induces targeted vasodilation. The small capillaries in the condentiva expand rapidly, forcing increased blood flow that presents clinically as severe ocular redness. To maintain systemic blood pressure during this sudden vasodilation, the autonomic nervous system compensates by increasing the resting heart rate. Alcohol also causes mild peripheral vasodilation, but it lacks the targeted ocular presentation, making its vascular effects far less visually pronounced. Cannabinoids also dictate specific glandular outputs, causing xerostomia, or dry mouth. This dissection maps out the presence of CB1 receptors directly within the salivary glands. When THC binds to these localized receptors, it actively blocks the signaling required to produce saliva. This is an active glandular suppression mechanism, completely separate from systemic dehydration. The classic visual cues of cannabis intoxication are direct, localized autonomic receptor responses. Over years of chronic use, the divergent biological processing of ethanol and THC translates into two entirely different categories of long-term pathology. Chronic ethanol exposure initiates progressive structural damage. Liver histology advances from healthy cells to steatosis to fibrosis, ending in cirrhosis. The primary driver is acetaldehyde. As the liver metabolizes ethanol, it creates this highly toxic compound, triggering oxidative stress, inflammation, and cellular death. Acetaldehyde damages DNA directly. This specific mechanism is why the World Health Organization strictly classifies alcohol as a known human carcinogen, directly linked to elevated rates of hepatic and gastrointestinal cancers. Prolonged alcohol use also forces the central nervous system into physical dependence. The brain adapts to the constant presence of ethanol by permanently altering its baseline GABA and glutamate production. Removing alcohol abruptly throws this fragile equilibrium into chaos, manifesting as acute withdrawal, causing dangerous neurological spikes that result in delirium tremens, seizures, and frequently death. Chronic THC exposure presents a different long-term risk profile. It does not drive structural cellular destruction, but instead forces profound functional neuroadaptation. Here we see an active synapse responding to heavy, repeated THC exposure. To maintain homeostasis, the brain physically removes or downregulates the quantity of available CB1 receptors. This receptor reduction creates a massive functional tolerance. The user requires increasingly higher doses to achieve baseline signaling, paving the pathway for cannabis use disorder. When a chronic user stops, the lack of available receptors causes insomnia, intense irritability, and severe mood fluctuations. However, because the respiratory pathways are uninvolved, this withdrawal lacks the fatal medical threat associated with alcohol. While THC itself is not classified as a direct carcinogen, heavy physical pathology still exists, dictated almost entirely by the method of delivery. When cannabis is smoked, the high-heat combustion process forces toxic byproducts into the pulmonary system, driving severe local tissue inflammation and chronic respiratory irritation. The use of unregulated vaporizers introduces further chemical threats. Additives like vitamin E acetate have been directly identified as the causal agent in severe acute lung injuries, known as EVALI. Ultimately, ethanol acts as a systemic toxin, driving progressive cellular death and fatal withdrawal. THC functions by rewiring neural processing and driving functional tolerance, with its physical tissue damage tied entirely to how it enters the lungs.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to NeuroMind Insights for more.